Hello everyone, welcome in today's video. In today's video, we'll be doing if narrative manipulation is overrated or misused.
What do you, the viewers, think it is?
Now already I have misled you because while I've said that the options were being overrated or misused, in fact I've come up with a more complicated solution, and that is that they can be grouped into three different types in which all of those three types have their own advantages and disadvantages. And that's what this video will be about. I'll be going over what I think are the three types of narrative manipulation, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of each one of them, as well as which one is probably the most powerful and overpowered version that you're probably thinking of when you say narrative manipulation, and why the misconception of it being overpowered exists. A quick heads up for something that the video was originally going to have, but something that I've decided not to do. I was originally going to make it so that we would cover every single example for each type of narrative manipulation that I'll go over in this video. However, if I do so, I feel like the informative part where we go over exactly how each one works and why they're different would be lost if I did that. So I'll go over a couple examples so that the point gets across, but in actuality I'm going to be more focusing on the technicality of each type of narrative manipulation. I want you guys in the comment section to comment what examples you guys can think of and what type you think they are and why. Now for type 1 narrative manipulation, technically not narrative manipulation. Or what I should be saying is type 1 narrative manipulation is effectively an anti-narrative manipulation ability best suited to counter people with type 2 narrative manipulation. So what do I mean when I say this? First, let me give a few examples. First example, probably one you guys can always think about when someone says, is this narrative manipulation, yes or no, and it's a bit debatable, is a fourth wall break. And I don't mean just speaking to the audience, I mean literally breaking the fourth wall, much like Blackbeard does here in One Piece, where he just shatters the to be continued button. Another example of one of these might be that when Deadpool can cut the panel so that he can go tell himself in the past information of what's going to happen later on. Therefore, he is more prepared. Or when he just has knowledge on what the script says so he knows what's happening later on. That also counts as another type of type 1 narrative manipulation. And the third, and probably my favourite example, is in The Disastrous Life of Psyche K, when a character from another verse comes in and tries to be the main character. Psyche is able to quite literally teleport him to another world, very much implied to be a different series. So effectively it is a narrative manipulation BFR. Now the reason why all of these are technically not narrative manipulation is all of them aren't actually doing anything against the narrative, in a way that we're not changing the narrative, we're using something else. So for example, when Blackbeard breaks the fourth wall, he's physically hitting it. When Deadpool cuts the manga panel, he is physically hitting it. When Deadpool is reading the future plot, he is just reading the information that comes later. When Psyche teleports someone, he is teleporting someone. These are abilities that themselves aren't narrative manipulation. What's actually happened is the scope of the ability, meaning the things that they can affect, has been extended to affect the narrative. So that's why it's technically not narrative manipulation, but it's very good against narrative manipulation. For example, Blackbeard could hit someone, and so could Deadpool, without it affecting the narrative, but they can also do it against the narrative. The best thing about these abilities is because they're technically not narrative manipulation, they're very good in what I like to call a debate context. If you ever go into a debate tournament, they quite often will have something like rules against certain abilities. However, these abilities inherently don't use the plot itself. You do not need to know what the plot is for Psyche K to teleport you to a new anime. Instead, that's just how far the range of his teleportation is. So an ability like this is very good in tournaments where something like narrative manipulation is banned, because technically speaking, this is not a banned ability, because it's technically not narrative manipulation. But these abilities are best used against other characters who have narrative manipulation. Because if a character has type 2 narrative manipulation, you could physically break out of it, as Deadpool and Blackbeard have shown. You could just find out what they're doing if they try and manipulate fate and just go against it by deciding otherwise. Or if you're Psyche K, you can just teleport and leave it. So that's why these are anti-narrative manipulation abilities. Type 2 narrative manipulation. This is what you were all thinking when someone says narrative manipulation. Or as what other people may say, plot manipulation, plot hacks, and that sort of thing, as example in this page of Versus Battle Wiki. I'll slowly go through this page as you can go through, as I then talk about what this basically is. This is the traditional narrative manipulation, where someone uses the narrative to manipulate things in the story. Space, time, objects, the fate of characters, all these different decisions that things can go on within the story. How this differs from a Type 1 narrative can be shown at a more fundamental level, and that's what I want to actually focus on. A Type 2 narrative manipulation is someone using the narrative to then manipulate something inside the story. What they are manipulating inside the story isn't a narrative though. If someone changes the story to change fate, the end result is someone changing fate. And if you compare this to a Type 1 narrative manipulation, a character is not using narrative manipulation, they're using something else, but they're instead able to affect the plot. This is why someone with a Type 1 narrative manipulation is technically an anti-Type 2 narrative manipulation, because they actually just cut it off. They're unable to use the source of narrative manipulation to activate their abilities. Now there is another important aspect of Type 2 narrative manipulation I want to cover. Remember, this video is going over whether or not narrative manipulation was going to be overrated or misused. Now this Type 2 narrative manipulation is the most common example you'll see people use. And in fact, using Type 2 in this way that many people think it's unbeatable because you're manipulating the plot and another character might not have resistance to the plot itself, it actually doesn't matter. Now why doesn't it matter? Well, think about it in the case of a machine and a battery. In this case, the thing powering our machine is the source of what the ability comes from, the narrative manipulation. However, if the machine itself is then doing something later on, like it's manipulating fate, time, or space, the end result isn't narrative manipulation, it is the manipulation of space, time, or fate. You are using the plot to manipulate something that isn't the plot. That then means that if a character has resistance to fate hacks, and you use the plot to manipulate fate, you're in fact just using a complicated form of fate hacks, meaning most characters who can resist fate can resist most forms of plot manipulation, because that's all that's going on. When a character manipulates the plot to manipulate fate, they can be resisted by a character who resists fate. And that can be said for all these different examples. If someone uses the plot to manipulate space and time, you just need to have resistance to space and time, because that's what's coming towards you. So with that, I would say that Type 2 narrative manipulation, the most common type of narrative manipulation that's used, is in fact overrated and misused. But what about something that's not overrated and not misused? Now for Type 3 narrative manipulation, this is what I consider proper narrative manipulation. So currently, if we look at the general description of each type of narrative manipulation, it can be summarized as such. Type 1 narrative manipulation, using something other than the narrative that will then affect the narrative. Type 2 narrative manipulation, using something that is the narrative to affect something that is then not the narrative. This leaves the only possibility left for Type 3 narrative manipulation to be using the narrative manipulation to affect the narrative. Going from narrative to narrative, essentially. So what are some examples like that? Well, first let's talk about the most common example that all of you should know off the top of your head, and that is any author in fiction. The idea behind it is, if you have a blank slate and you're writing the story upon it, you are therefore writing story onto story. Therefore, you are using the narrative manipulation to create your narrative. So any author sort of scan or scaling like that would all be a Type 3 narrative manipulation. However, that's not the only example. I in fact found several different examples which are probably more interesting than just saying author level to go over Type 3 narrative manipulation. The examples I have found that I think you might like are, the first one, using plot manipulation to define the plot. This is something that is used in Slay the Princess. And the second one is using plot manipulation to corrupt others from Who is Lila? And the last one, and probably the most controversial, will be the fourth wall breaking corruption aimed at people outside the plot, and that is something that appears in real life Slenderman lore. Let's go over each one of these. Now let's start off with probably the most complicated of the lot, and that is the princess from Slay the Princess. The princess has something very unique and very overpowered about her, and that is, technically speaking, the princess in Slay the Princess is an undefined character. You see, the story of Slay the Princess works like this. You, the hero, go meet the princess, and whatever you interact and think about the princess becomes reality. The different endings throughout the game are exactly as the plot is written. That means the princess herself doesn't have a defined plot or aspect to her. Instead, this aspect is one defined by people's perspective. So if you were to example have the princess from Slay the Princess go against someone like Goku, what this would mean that if Goku's perception of the princess was stronger than him, he would lose because she would be stronger than him. She's defined by the perception of those in front of her. And that is how she used her plot manipulation to manipulate the plot as it goes forward to define herself. She goes from an undefined character to a defined character to whatever is seen in front of her. This is extremely powerful as it basically skips most forms of scaling, and if you looked on a mutual point of view, it doesn't have any scaling. So you can use its character in any debate tournament you want. For my next example, let's look at Who is Lila? Who is Lila is a perfect example of stories that weaponizes the narrative itself. The game revolves around the mystery of Lila, but that mystery is meant to be unresolved, as it is unresolvable by design. Lila gives multiple contradictory explanations to her existence, being a psychological construct, vengeful spirit, a program, an alternate persona, etc. All the classics. But each one is not true, and these are being told to someone in the game known as Detective Yu. Detective Yu is a fourth wall breaking detective that appears at the end of each one of these mini endings of the game to explain what's going on and ask Lila who she is and what is going on for their reasons of doing certain things. However, Hegan doesn't know who Lila is despite having more knowledge than the game player himself, or the reader, or the narrative. But the horror of the game itself is then finding out what Lila is. See, Lila is what I like to call a parasite. Think about a story. A story only comes to life because a reader, a viewer, an author gives them life. Now what's happening with Lila is she is a narrative hazard that only exists because those who investigate who is Lila then become narratively corrupt. Quite literally, to answer the question who is Lila, you are becoming one that is corrupted by Lila. This is a narrative ability in sense of someone using their narrative on Lila corrupts themselves through their own narrative to beat Lila. Therefore, to answer who is Lila is to become essentially like the next host in a way. It's a narrative level corruption that scales to any character who themselves is looking at the question who is Lila. So different to the princess who is defined by the other's narrative, Lila's narrative scales to whoever's trying to impose themselves onto her. Before we dive into the Slenderman ability, allow me to build a scene around how absurdly overpowerful this is going to be. Years ago, I was in a debate server where I debated someone who was really desperate to beat me to the point where they used a character whose stats were above everything on Character Stats and Profile Plus versus Battle Wiki and had every ability on Superpower Wiki combined into just one character. Of course, this is literally a fan character. Yet, despite this, I was able to defeat this person and their fan character in only one argument. This was one ability of Slenderman, and I even told them beforehand I was using Slenderman, so you'd think they would research and know what's going on. Yet this ability completely bypassed anything they could come up with. To stay PG friendly in this video, I won't be going into too much of the real life context of this, but just understand that there is some extra context real life if you want to do some research in your own time. Slenderman's influence in media throughout fiction was so strong, it had what's called a Tupler effect. The Tupler effect is an implication where something's popularity, even fictional, gets so strong it has real life implications. To the point where if you were talking about a fictional character and their ability, you described as hacks as, if someone has knowledge of Slenderman, even if they think he's fictional, even if they don't believe in him, and even if they dismiss him completely, that knowledge alone is enough to plant an idea in their head which corrupts them. This is not an attack he uses, some technique he activates, or some passive automatic ability. It's a reality anchor effect that happens just because you think of it. Because of that, the scaling of this isn't one that scales to Slenderman, but it scales to whichever opponent thinks about Slenderman, or something even better. You see, because this Tupler effect is fourth wall breaking and it happened to people in real life, no joke, that then means that if, for example, Slenderman could defeat someone like Goku, not because he would corrupt Goku for having knowledge on Slenderman, because obviously Goku doesn't, he would instead corrupt someone like Toriyama, because to defeat Goku, he only needs to corrupt Toriyama. So quite literally, Goku could lose because someone else has knowledge on it, and that someone else is his author, effectively bypassing all the fictional scaling Goku could have. This is a ridiculously overpowered ability, and I do regret using this in a debate because, quite honestly, that's very cheap of an ability to use. There are some things much more powerful than Boundless. Now let's go back to what we said earlier in this video, what we were covering. Yes, we've now said that all three types of narratives, we've mentioned their advantages and disadvantages, and we've said kind of in a way which one is the overall strongest, obviously being a type 3 narrative manipulation. However, we haven't actually answered the last part where I said, is narrative manipulation overpowered or a misconception? So let me explain. If we start off with what is the most common example, which is a type 2 narrative manipulation, where someone manipulates a narrative to cause an effect which isn't narrative manipulation, like manipulating the narrative to change space, time, or fate. This one isn't overpowered and is quite overrated, because in the end, you don't have to manipulate the narrative to be able to resist it. Instead, all you got to do is resist the end result. If someone uses the narrative to try and manipulate space, you only need to be able to resist space manipulation, because that is exactly what's being affected towards you. And with that sort of thing in mind, we can say that a type 2 narrative manipulation is definitely more on the overrated side and misused in terms of trying to say it's some game ender in a debate. What about type 1 narrative manipulation? Well, this one is even more overrated, because in the end, type 1 narrative manipulation is when you use something that isn't the narrative to then affect the narrative itself. So if someone could punch and break the fourth wall, that only gains its fourth wall breaking effect when going up against narrative manipulation. So in other words, if you're just using it in a normal debate, where neither opponent has narrative manipulation, this just doesn't do anything, and it's just a regular punch. So therefore that one could be more overrated, although it could be very useful against a type 2 narrative manipulation character because it's a counter to it. Lastly is the type 3 narrative manipulation, and this one is not overrated at all. If someone has type 3 narrative manipulation, they are completely overpowered and ridiculous. Being able to bypass any sort of stats, ability hacks, resistance, and that sort of thing just because of the function of a type 3 narrative manipulation, I would honestly say in debates, this is the type of thing you should ban just to make things more fair and interesting. And with that, thank you all for watching this video. Now whether you agree or disagree with this video, I think splitting narrative hacks into 3 different general types is quite useful, so here's a screenshot of a nice diagram that I've come up with. Hope you all enjoyed this video. Check out the description for other YouTube channels of power scalers that I quite enjoy. Thank you all for watching. Have a good day.